The seam was almost invisible, just a hairline shadow where two sections of wood met at a corner post. Nora Brennan ran her fingertips across the joint for the third time that morning, feeling something her eyes couldn't quite confirm, a gap so slight it might have been imagination, except that her father had taught her to trust her hands over her vision. "Mom, you've been staring at that post for 20 minutes. Elliot leaned against the door frame of the second-floor workshop, backpack still slung over one shoulder from the bus ride home. At 14, she'd inherited Thomas's spatial intelligence, along with his impatience for inefficiency. 23 minutes, actually, but Nora didn't correct her. She pressed harder against the wood, applying pressure at different angles the way Thomas had demonstrated when she was Elliot's age, searching for mechanical advantage that would reveal hidden structure. The post resisted, solid and unmoving, mocking her certainty that something lay beneath its ordinary surface. Grandpa built this whole workshop himself in 1983. Nora shifted her weight, trying a different approach. He didn't do anything by accident. If there's a seam here, it means something. 6 months had passed since Thomas's death. 6 months of living in the drafty third-floor apartment above the workshop he'd bequeathed her. 6 months of her brother's mockery, echoing in memory garbage, worthless, condemned shithole. Garrett had laughed so hard at the will reading that other people in the attorney's office had turned to stare. Rowan had just shaken his head with theatrical pity, making sure everyone witnessed his magnanimity at not contesting such an obviously inequitable distribution. They'd gotten properties worth millions. Nora had gotten a building that probably violated 40 different code requirements and smelled permanently of sawdust and machine oil. Except that didn't make sense. Nothing about Thomas Brennan had been careless or random. Every joint he'd cut, every board he'd selected, every design he'd drafted carried intention that revealed itself only to patient observation. The workshop might look worthless to people who measured value in market comparables and tax assessments, but Thomas had spent 40 years here building furniture that clients treasured across generations, teaching his daughter that real wealth required skills nobody could repossess. "Maybe call Gus," Elliot's suggestion was practical. August Castellano had been Thomas's partner for 4 decades, the only person who might understand what Thomas had embedded in the building's structure. Nora pulled out her phone, then hesitated. Gus was 68, still working full-time, probably exhausted from whatever commission currently occupied his bench. Calling him to examine a seam that might be nothing felt like admitting defeat, like she couldn't solve her father's puzzles without help. But Thomas had always insisted that asking questions demonstrated wisdom rather than weakness, that collaboration produced better outcomes than solitary struggle. She pressed Gus's contact, the phone ringing twice before his familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Katie, everything okay?" The use of her childhood nickname was automatic for him, muscle memory from decades of Saturday mornings when young Nora had appeared in the workshop while her brothers chose golf over sawdust. "There's a corner post in the workshop. Second floor northwest corner. It has a seam that doesn't match the construction drawings." She kept her voice level, stating facts without the hope that threatened to crack her composure. Silence stretched for several seconds. Then, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The flashback hit without warning as Nora waited for Gus, memory asserting itself with the violent clarity that grief occasionally deployed 6 months earlier. Thomas in a hospital bed that made him look smaller than she'd ever seen him, machines beeping their monotonous measurement of remaining time. She'd driven up from Boston the moment Garrett called, his voice tight, with something that might have been actual emotion beneath the performative concern he wielded like a tool. 3 hours in traffic that felt like 3 years arriving to find her father conscious, but diminished, 72 years of life compressed into a frame that barely dented the mattress. "Katie." His voice had been weak but clear. No confusion or delirium, just Thomas Brennan calculating odds and making final arrangements. "The workshop. Don't let them take it." "I won't, ba." She'd used the Vietnamese term deliberately, the word he'd taught her, even though neither of them had Vietnamese heritage. His small rebellion against her mother's insistence on rigid formality, his private language with the daughter who'd actually listened when he explained the difference between joinery that held and joinery that merely looked adequate. "They'll laugh." His breathing was labored, each word requiring effort. "Your brothers, at the reading. They'll think they won." The prediction had been specific enough to worry her. "Won what?" But Thomas had just gripped her hand with surprising strength, his calluses rough against her palm. "Let them laugh. Their contempt is your protection. Remember that." She tried to ask what he meant, but his eyes had closed, exhaustion claiming him before explanation could follow. He died 17 hours later with all 3 children present. Garrett checking his phone periodically. Rowan reviewing documents from some case that apparently couldn't wait for their father's final breath, Nora holding Thomas's hand and trying to understand his cryptic warning. The will reading came 3 weeks later in Margaret Pierce's law office, formal mahogany and leather chairs that spoke of old money and established practice. Garrett had arrived in his BMW wearing a suit that cost more than Nora's monthly rent. Rowan had flown up from Boston in clothes that announced his partnership at a corporate firm where associates billed $400 per hour. Nora had worn a dress from the thrift store on Congress Street, the nicest thing she owned then, that didn't have visible repairs. Margaret had read through the standard legal preamble before reaching the substantive distributions, her professional neutrality betraying nothing about what was coming. To my eldest son, Garrett Thomas Brennan, I leave the following properties: the commercial building at 114 Harbor Street, Portland, Maine, the residential triplex at 47 Ocean Avenue, Cape Elizabeth, the mixed-use development at 223 4th Street, Portland, and the vacation property at 18 Cliff Road, Ogunquit. Combined assessed value $4.2 million. Garrett had smiled, the expression carrying satisfaction that he'd correctly anticipated his inheritance. As the eldest and most financially successful, he'd obviously deserved the largest share. To my middle son, Rowan Michael Brennan, I leave the following assets: the investment portfolio held at Fidelity brokerage account ending in 7432, current value $3.8 million, and the beach house at 91 Atlantic Avenue, Wells, Maine, assessed value $400,000. Combined value $4.2 million. Rowan had nodded, the equivalence between brothers apparently meeting his standards for equity. He'd glanced at Nora with expression that mixed pity and condescension. Obviously, she'd get something smaller, more appropriate to her station as the youngest and least accomplished child. Margaret had paused before reading the final distribution, and Nora had recognized something in the attorney's preparation for reaction, bracing for the explosion that was coming. To my daughter, Nora Catherine Brennan, I leave the workshop building at 73 Marginal Way, Portland, Maine, including all tools, equipment, materials, and contents therein. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds before Garrett started laughing. Not polite amusement or gentle mirth, but actual body-shaking laughter that filled Margaret's office with sound that made the attorney wince. Rowan joined him seconds later, the brothers united in finding humor in their father's cosmic joke. The workshop, Garrett had finally managed between gasps. He left Katie the fucking workshop. That building's been condemned, waiting to happen for 20 years. Rowan's assessment was delivered between chuckles. City's probably got a demolition order already drafted. Assessed value is what, maybe 200,000. Garrett had pulled out his phone, actually looking up the property records. 187,000. Jesus. We each get over 4 million, and Katie gets the garbage pile. Margaret had maintained professional composure, but her discomfort was evident. Mr. Brennan, perhaps? No, this is perfect. Garrett had wiped tears from his eyes, still laughing. Dad's final lesson: success goes to those who earn it. Sorry, Katie, but you spent your life doing nothing while Rowan and I built careers. This is what happens when you waste your potential. The cruelty was casual, reflexive, honed by decades of practice. Nora had sat frozen in her chair, feeling her face heat with humiliation that everyone in the office was witnessing. Other clients in the waiting room could probably hear Garrett's performance, his belief that loudness equaled authority. Actually, she'd started to respond, but Rowan had cut her off. Don't feel bad, Katie. The workshop probably has sentimental value, right? You can visit Dad's memory while Garrett and I actually use our inheritance to build wealth. His tone suggested magnanimity, as if he were being generous by not laughing quite as hard as his older brother. If you want to sell it to me, I'll give you 40,000. Garrett's offer had come too quickly, revealing calculation beneath the performance. Cash within the week, probably more than you'll get from anyone else. The speed of the offer had triggered suspicion. Why would Garrett want a condemned building in an industrial area unless it held value he wasn't mentioning? But before Nora could analyze, Rowan had added his own assessment. 40's generous, Garrett. That building needs 200,000 in repairs before it's habitable. The electrical alone is probably 100,000. I'm feeling charitable. Garrett had shrugged, still smiling. What do you say, Katie? Quick sale, you walk away with 40 grand and don't have to deal with Dad's junk. She'd looked at Margaret, who'd given the slightest headshake, not advice, just acknowledgement that Nora had options beyond accepting Garrett's opportunism. Thomas's warning echoed in her memory. They'll laugh. Let them laugh. Their contempt is your protection. I'll keep it. Her voice had been quieter than intended, but firm. Thanks anyway. Your funeral. Garrett had stood clearly, considering the meeting concluded. Don't come crying to us when the city fines you for code violations. They'd left together already discussing how to leverage their inheritances into greater wealth strategies for maximum ROI and optimal market positioning. Nora had remained in her chair, staring at the single page that constituted her inheritance. One building assessed value $187,000, structural condition unknown. Margaret had waited until the brothers departed before speaking. Your father left very specific instructions about the workshop. He made me promise not to disclose them until after your brothers heard their distributions. What instructions? Nora's confusion was genuine. Come back tomorrow, 9 a.m., just you. There are documents you need to see. Margaret's careful phrasing suggested complexity that couldn't be discussed in the immediate aftermath of the reading. Can you tell me? Tomorrow, Nora, trust me on this. The attorney's expression had held something that looked like satisfaction, mixed with anticipation, as if she knew the punchline to a joke that would take time to fully land. Elliot had been waiting in the parking lot, having refused to attend the reading, but insisting on being nearby for support. One look at Nora's face had told her everything. Bad. They laughed. Nora had unlocked the car with hands that shook slightly. Garrett laughed so hard he cried. They each got over $4 million. I got a workshop that's probably going to collapse during the next strong wind. Why would Grandpa do that? Elliot's question carried the directness of someone young enough to expect fairness from the universe. I don't know. Nora had started the engine, eager to escape before Garrett and Rowan emerged from the building and subjected her to additional commentary. But Dad said to let them laugh, said their contempt was my protection. I need to figure out what he meant. Gus arrived at the workshop driving the same pickup truck he'd owned since before Nora was born, rust-spotted and reliable practical transportation that matched his philosophy about tools and possessions. He climbed the stairs to the second floor with the careful movements of someone whose knees had logged too many hours standing at workbenches, examined the corner post with hands that had built alongside Thomas for 42 years. He never showed you this. Gus's question was gentle, lacking any judgment about the gap in her knowledge. Showed me what? Nora moved closer, watching him trace the seam with fingertips that knew wood better than most people knew their spouses. This post is hollow. He pressed a specific point, and something clicked, barely audible but definite. Thomas installed it in 1987, 3 years after you were born. Never told me what was inside. How do you open it? Elliot had moved closer, phone out, and recording, documenting the discovery with Generation Z instinct for preservation. Gus was already working the mechanism, his movements suggesting familiarity with Thomas's habits, if not this specific installation. The panel slid rather than swung, revealing a hollow cavity lined with what looked like foam insulation. Inside, wrapped in plastic and sealed against moisture, blueprints, rolled tight enough to fit the narrow space, and an envelope with Nora's name written in Thomas's precise architectural printing. She reached in with hands that trembled, extracting the contents like artifacts from an archaeological dig. The blueprints crinkled as she unrolled them on a nearby workbench, using clamps to hold them flat. 2 sets, she realized. Both showed the workshop building, but with different details. The first matched the official plans filed with the city in 1982, 3 floors basic, commercial structure, nothing unusual. The second showed additional features that weren't in the public record, a basement level that didn't appear on any city documentation, accessed through what looked like the lumber storage area on the ground floor. There's a basement, Elliot zoomed in with her phone, capturing the architectural drawings that her grandfather had hidden for reasons not yet clear. Not according to city records. Gus was studying the plans with professional attention, noting measurements and structural details. Thomas built this place himself, did all the work over 2 summers. I helped with framing, but he handled the finishing alone, said he wanted privacy for the detail work. Why hide a basement? Nora couldn't see the advantage. Basement space added value, increased usable square footage, improved thermal efficiency. Read the letter. Gus gestured to the envelope, still sitting sealed. That'll explain better than I can. Nora broke the seal, carefully extracting pages that had been written by hand, unusual for Thomas, who typically used computer for anything longer than shopping lists. The letter was dated 2 weeks before his death, written when he must have known time was finite. Katie, if you were reading this, you found the first post. Good. That means you paid attention during those Saturday mornings when Garrett and Rowan were playing golf. They thought manual labor was beneath them. You understood it was where real value lived. The workshop I left you is worth more than the properties your brothers inherited, significantly more. But they can't know that yet because knowledge would make them dangerous. Their laughter at the reading was necessary. Their contempt protects what I've built for you. The basement exists outside city records. I built it in 1987, claimed the space was just deeper foundation for structural support. The inspector passed it without requiring documentation because I'd built reputation for quality work. That basement contains assets I've accumulated over 40 years, furniture I built, but never sold, tools I collected, materials I acquired when they were still legal to purchase, and financial instruments held in your name since before you could walk. Combined value of the basement contents approximately $9 million. Your brothers each receive properties that appear valuable, but carry mortgages and liens they don't know about yet. The Harbor Street building has a $2.8 million note. The Ocean Avenue triplex has $3.1 million outstanding. The 4th Street development has $4.2 million in construction loans. Ogunquit is clear, but only worth $300,000. I inflated the assessment by claiming renovations that never happened. Total net value of Garrett's inheritance approximately $1.2 million, not $4.2. Rowan's portfolio looks impressive until you examine the holdings. 70% was invested in a company that I knew would file bankruptcy within 6 months. It did 3 weeks ago. The beach house has foundation issues that will cost $200,000 to repair, and I never disclosed them to get higher assessment. His actual inheritance approximately $800,000, not $4.2 million. I gave them exactly what they valued: appearances of wealth, impressive numbers they could boast about to friends, assets that look good on paper. I gave you what actually matters: tools to build, skills to create, and capital to deploy when you're ready. The basement entrance is in the lumber storage room. The key is your birthday, 06/15/1982. Everything inside belongs to you, has always belonged to you. I established the accounts when you were 5 and 7 years old, long before your brothers could claim I was showing favoritism or manipulating you. Why did I structure the inheritance this way? Because Garrett and Rowan spent their lives chasing status and appearance. They bought houses they couldn't afford, cars they didn't need, convinced themselves that looking successful meant being successful. I tried to teach them the difference. They weren't interested in learning from someone who worked with his hands. You learned because you paid attention. You learned because you asked questions. You learned because you valued the work itself rather than what it signaled to others. Your brothers will discover eventually that their inheritance wasn't what they thought. They'll be angry. They'll try to challenge the will, claim I defrauded them or manipulated you. Let them try. Everything is documented. Every account is legal. Every asset is properly titled. Margaret has copies of all records going back 30 years. The contempt they showed at the reading, that was my final gift to you. They announced to a room full of witnesses that they considered the workshop worthless. That protects you from claims that you misrepresented value or hid assets. They stated publicly that you got garbage. Now it's too late for them to change that narrative. Use the basement assets wisely. Build something that matters. Teach Elliot what I taught you. The workshop isn't just a building. It's a lesson about what actually constitutes wealth. I'm proud of you, Katie. Not because you became an architect, though that matters. Because you understood that skill compounds while appearances evaporate. Because you never needed to prove anything to people who measured worth in dollars and titles. The money in those accounts is yours free and clear. The furniture and tools are yours to sell or keep. The workshop itself is yours to use or renovate or expand. All of it has been waiting for you since before you were old enough to understand what it meant. Build something beautiful. Build something that lasts. But Nora read the letter 3 times each pass, revealing new layers of her father's planning, the complexity of his strategy, the specific cruelty he'd deployed against his sons while protecting his daughter. $9 million. Hidden in a basement that shouldn't exist, accumulated over decades while appearing to live on modest carpenter's income. He really did this. Her voice came out, whisper quiet, disbelief and wonder mixing with something that felt like grief complicated by revelation. Thomas had spent years building this inheritance while letting his sons believe he was poor, while accepting their condescension about his manual labor career, while watching them waste money on expensive toys and status symbols. Thomas planned everything. Gus had been reading over her shoulder, his expression suggesting he'd suspected something but never known details. 42 years I worked with him, never mentioned assets beyond the workshop. But every few months he'd sell a piece of furniture for $30,000, $40,000, prices that seemed high even for his quality. I assumed he was just good at finding wealthy clients. He was funding the accounts. Nora checked the letter again, looking for any indication of illegal activity or tax evasion, anything that would invalidate the gift. But Thomas had specifically mentioned documentation, proper titling, legal structuring. A man who'd built furniture with precision that lasted generations wouldn't risk fortune on sloppy financial planning. Can we see the basement? Elliot's question was practical, cutting through the emotional complexity to focus on immediate verification. The lumber storage room occupied the ground floor's northeast corner, accessible through a door that Nora had opened maybe 3 times in 6 months of living in the building. Inside, rough-cut boards and plywood sheets leaned against walls that looked like standard construction concrete block painted industrial gray, nothing suggesting hidden features. Gus moved to the north wall, running his hands across blocks until he found what he was looking for. A section that shifted under pressure, revealing electronic keypad behind a false panel. The mechanism was sophisticated, the kind of security that required professional installation, and suggested Thomas had taken concealment seriously. Your birthday. Nora punched in 06151982, the sequence her father had specified. A motor hummed somewhere behind the wall, and a section of blocks swung inward, revealing stairs that descended into darkness. Motion sensor lights flickered on, automatically illuminating a space that shouldn't exist. 1,200 square feet, according to the blueprints, climate-controlled based on the dehumidifier running in the corner, finished with the same attention to detail that Thomas had applied to everything he built. The basement was organized into 4 distinct sections, each serving different purpose in Thomas's long accumulation. Section 1 held furniture, 47 pieces, ranging from small jewelry boxes to a massive dining table that could seat 12. Each piece displayed Thomas's signature, precision, hand-cut dovetails that looked like they'd grown from the wood rather than being carved finishes, so perfect they seemed to deepen into the grain proportions that achieved beauty through mathematical accuracy rather than decoration. Furniture that clients would commission for $30,000 and consider themselves lucky to own. Section 2 contained wood-rare species that had been legal to harvest when Thomas purchased them, but were now banned or restricted. Brazilian rosewood from 1986, Cuban mahogany from 1990, Burmese teak from 1978. Boards that specialized dealers would pay premium for because legal existing stock was finite and shrinking. Section 3 held tools, antique hand planes that collectors fought over, vintage chisels that held edges better than modern steel, specialty equipment that Thomas had acquired from estates and workshop closures over 40 years. The kind of collection that appeared occasionally at auction and drove bidding into territory that made news. Section 4 was filing cabinets, 4 legal-size units containing what Nora assumed were the documents Thomas had mentioned. Bank statements, investment records, purchase receipts, authentication certificates, everything needed to prove ownership and validate value. She opened the first filing cabinet drawer, pulling folders at random, finding documentation that confirmed the letter's claims. Portland Federal Credit Union account ending in 4782, established February 1987, titled In Trust for Nora, Catherine Brennan. Current balance $2,347,000. Fidelity Investments account ending in 9021, established June 1993, same title structure. Current balance $4,683,000. 2 more accounts at smaller regional banks, combined balance $541,000. Plus real estate deeds for 3 properties in Portland's Old Port District that Thomas had purchased in the early 2000s when prices were low, now worth collectively around $3 million based on recent comparable sales. The numbers were staggering even after Thomas's letter had prepared her. $9.5 million in liquid and near-liquid assets conservatively. More if the furniture and tools brought premium prices at specialist auctions. Significantly more if the rare woods sold to the right buyers who understood that legally acquired pre-ban inventory commanded multiples of current market prices. Mom, Elliot's voice pulled Nora from calculations that were making her dizzy. Is this real? Gus answered before Nora could. Thomas was a lot of things, but he wasn't a liar. If he said $9 million, it's $9 million. Probably more. The old carpenter was examining a sideboard that demonstrated Thomas's mastery at its peak, figured walnut, with hand-cut joinery so precise the surfaces appeared to flow continuously around corners without visible breaks. Museum quality, easily the kind of piece that institutional collectors purchase for permanent collections. This one alone is worth $70,000, maybe $80,000. Gus's assessment was delivered with certainty born from decades of industry experience. Harrison Kimball in Boston would buy it sight unseen at that price. Nora did rapid mental math. 47 furniture pieces averaging even $40,000 each meant $2 million in inventory. The wood collection would bring another $500,000 based on rareness and condition. Tools maybe 200,000 if sold properly through specialist channels. And that wasn't counting the 7 million in financial accounts that had been sitting in her name, growing through compound returns for over 30 years. Her brothers had laughed at her inheritance in Margaret Pierce's office, announced to everyone present that she'd gotten garbage while they received millions. They'd been so certain, so smug in their assessment, that youngest daughter had been appropriately diminished by a father who obviously understood merit. Thomas had let them be certain, had structured everything so that their contempt would be documented, witnessed impossible to later deny. When they discovered the truth, and they would discover it eventually, there would be no way to claim they'd been deceived or that value had been hidden from them. They'd publicly declared the workshop worthless. That declaration protected Nora from any accusation of fraud or manipulation. What do I do with this? The question was directed at Gus, but really asked of the universe of fate, of whatever forces had put her in position to inherit wealth she'd never anticipated, while pretending to be poor enough that thrift store clothes were necessity rather than aesthetic choice. First thing, Gus's response was characteristically practical. Don't tell anyone. Not friends, not colleagues, definitely not your brothers. You've got maybe 6 months before Garrett figures out his properties are underwater. Maybe a year before Rowan discovers his portfolio is worthless. You need that time to move assets, establish security, prepare for whatever they'll do when they realize what happened. Move assets where, Nora's knowledge of high net worth financial planning was essentially zero. Margaret will know. That's why Thomas had you meet with her tomorrow. She's been handling the legal structure for decades. Gus moved toward the stairs, already thinking tactically. But tonight you secure this space. Nobody gets in here until you decide what stays and what sells. Elliot was filming everything, documenting the furniture and tools and filing cabinets with systematic attention that would provide inventory baseline. Smart kid, Nora thought, already understanding that what they'd found required documentation, protection, strategy beyond simple celebration. They secured the basement and returned to the third-floor apartment, the three of them sitting at a table Thomas had built in 1995, eating takeout pizza that tasted like cardboard, because Nora's brain couldn't process mundane experiences while simultaneously trying to absorb the magnitude of what had been revealed. Grandpa basically called Uncle Garrett and Uncle Rowan failures. Elliot's assessment was blunt, typical teenage directness, cutting through complexity. He gave them fake wealth and gave you real wealth because he thought they were wasteful idiots. More complicated than that. But Nora wasn't sure it was, actually. Thomas's letter had been loving toward her and coldly calculating toward his sons. He'd watched them make financial mistakes for decades and decided they deserved to fail, deserved to learn through loss what they'd refused to learn through instruction. Was he right? Elliot's question carried weight beyond its simplicity. Nora thought about Garrett's BMW and Rowan's waterfront condo, the expensive restaurants and luxury vacations her brothers posted on social media, the constant performance of wealth that seemed to require audience validation. She thought about her own choices, the thrift store clothes, the used car she drove until it couldn't drive anymore, the careful budgeting that Garrett had once mocked as poverty mindset. Yeah, the admission hurt because it meant accepting that her father had judged his children and found two of them wanting. He was right. They'll lose everything he gave them because they never learned that wealth requires building, not just having. But you learned, Gus's statement carried pride. Saturday mornings for 10 years you came to the workshop while your brothers played golf. Thomas taught you dovetails and mortises and how to read grain. That wasn't just woodworking. That was education in patience, precision, the compounding return of skill practiced across time. The lesson crystallized with clarity that made Nora's chest tight. Thomas hadn't just given her money. He'd given her the training to use it wisely, had spent a decade teaching philosophy through joinery and finished work. Every Saturday morning had been preparation for this inheritance foundation laid long before the structure became visible. Her brothers had chosen differently, had decided that manual labor was beneath them, that their father's carpentry was embarrassment rather than craft. They'd pursued wealth through credentials and careers, accumulating impressive titles while never learning to build anything that lasted beyond the next quarterly earnings report. Thomas had let them choose, had watched their choices compound into character, then structured inheritance that validated or punished those accumulated decisions. He'd given Garrett and Rowan exactly what they demonstrated they valued: appearance and status. He'd given Nora what she'd proven she valued: tools and skill and capital to deploy according to wisdom rather than ego. The cruelty was sophisticated, operating on levels that would take her brothers years to fully comprehend. By the time they understood what Thomas had done, it would be too late to change outcomes. Their contempt had been documented. Their assessment of the workshop as worthless had been witnessed. The legal structure was airtight. Nora sat in her father's chair, feeling weight that transcended the physical inheritance. $9 million required responsibility she wasn't sure she possessed. Thomas had trusted her with fortune he'd spent 40 years building, had bet everything on his judgment that she would use it better than her brothers would have. The question was whether his trust was justified or whether she'd prove as fallible as the sons he'd written off. Outside Portland Harbor hummed with evening activity boats, returning with their loads, tourists wandering the waterfront in search of authentic maritime experience that was mostly performance for their benefit. The workshop sat among industrial buildings that were slowly being converted to condos and galleries. Brick structures waiting to be claimed by gentrification or demolished to make room for development. Thomas had bought this building in 1978 for $80,000. Now it sat on land worth millions based solely on location. The business he'd built here, the actual carpentry work, had been secondary to the real estate appreciation he'd captured by holding rather than selling. Another lesson Nora was only beginning to comprehend: patience compounds. Assets held across decades generate returns that short-term thinking can't match. Thomas hadn't gotten rich through brilliant trades or lucky timing. He'd gotten rich through steady accumulation, through building value that nobody else recognized, through waiting while everyone else chased immediate returns. "I should feel happy." Nora's statement came out flat, lacking the emotion that should accompany sudden wealth. $9 million. I should be celebrating. You're grieving. Gus's insight was gentle. Thomas gave you treasure, but you'd trade it all for one more Saturday morning with him in the workshop. The truth of that landed hard. Nora would empty every account, sell every piece of furniture, give it all away for the chance to ask Thomas questions she hadn't known to ask while he was alive. Why had he been so cruel to her brothers? Had he really believed they were beyond teaching? What would he want her to do with inheritance that carried weight beyond its monetary value? But Thomas was gone and the workshop remained, and $9 million waited in accounts and assets that required decisions she wasn't prepared to make. Elliot leaned against her shoulder, 14 years old and already understanding that wealth complicated more than it solved. "What would Grandpa want you to do?" The answer was in the letter, actually. Thomas had been explicit. "Build something that matters. Teach Elliot what I taught you. Use the assets wisely. Build, teach, use wisely. Not spend, not consume, not display. Build." The imperative was clear, even if the specific application remained uncertain. "I need to think." Nora stood, moving to the window that overlooked Marginal Way and the harbor beyond. "This is too much to process in one night. Sleep on it." Gus was already heading toward the door. "Tomorrow you meet with Margaret, get the legal structure explained. Then you decide next steps. But Katie," he paused at the threshold, "don't tell your brothers anything until you're ready. Once they know, everything changes. You can't unring that bell." After he left, Nora and Elliot sat in silence, both processing revelations that would reshape their lives in ways they couldn't yet predict. The workshop creaked around them, old timbers settling a building that held secrets even after revealing its primary treasure. There might be more. Elliot's observation was quiet but landed with impact. "The letter said you found the first post. That means there are others." Nora hadn't caught that detail, but now that Elliot mentioned it, the implication was clear. Thomas had hidden the blueprints and letter in one corner post. Why that specific post, unless others held additional contents? The workshop had dozens of structural posts. Any of them could contain messages, documents, artifacts that Thomas had secreted away for future discovery. "We search tomorrow." The decision was immediate. "After I meet with Margaret, we go through the building systematically, check every post, every apparently solid surface. If Dad hid one thing, he probably hid others." The prospect added another layer to already complex situation. Thomas had planned elaborately structured, carefully embedded clues and treasures throughout a building that appeared ordinary to casual inspection. The workshop wasn't just inheritance, it was puzzle lesson, ongoing conversation with a father who'd understood that some knowledge required time and discovery rather than direct transmission. Nora returned to the window, looking out at Portland's waterfront as it transitioned from working harbor to entertainment district, the city's industrial past being systematically erased by developers who saw more value in condos than in the businesses that had built the local economy. The workshop sat among them like survivor from different era brick walls that had witnessed a century of use and would likely witness another if properly maintained. Thomas had given her this building, knowing what it represented last generation, before everything became commodified, before craft was replaced by consumption, before building things with your hands became quaint nostalgia rather than foundational skill. The workshop was museum and workshop, simultaneously preserving techniques while continuing to deploy them. And now it belonged to Denora, along with fortune she'd never anticipated, responsibility she hadn't prepared for, and brothers who would eventually discover they'd been outmaneuvered by a father they'd dismissed as simple carpenter. The coming months would test everything Thomas had taught her. His faith in her judgment would be validated or revealed as wishful thinking. The inheritance would either compound through wise deployment or evaporate through mistakes that wealth sometimes encouraged. But tonight, standing in a building her father had constructed with his own hands, surrounded by evidence of his decades of patient accumulation, Nora felt something beyond grief or anxiety or doubt. She felt connected to lineage that valued building over having, creating over consuming, teaching over boasting. Thomas Brennan had spent 40 years constructing this inheritance. The least Nora could do was honor his work by using it properly. Not just the money, the lesson embedded in how he'd structured the gift, why he'd hidden it, who he'd trusted to receive it. Build something that matters. Teach the next generation. Use resources wisely. Those imperatives would guide whatever came next. The workshop waited patient and solid, ready to house whatever Nora chose to create from the foundation her father had laid. Outside, evening deepened into night. Harbor sounds shifting from commercial activity to entertainment noise. The workshop's lights glowed against darkness beacon in an area that was changing fast, but hadn't changed completely. Not yet. Nora closed the curtains and returned to the table where Elliot had fallen asleep on her homework, exhausted by discoveries that would take weeks to fully process. She covered her daughter with a blanket Thomas had made practical wool that would outlast anything purchased at retail, and settled into the chair her father had occupied for 40 years. Tomorrow would bring Margaret's explanations, legal structures, financial planning. Tomorrow would begin the process of converting revelation into strategy. But tonight, Nora just sat in her father's workshop, feeling the weight of trust he'd placed in her, hoping she was equal to the responsibility he'd bestowed. The workshop creaked around her old building, settling into night, keeping its remaining secrets until she was ready to discover them. And somewhere in the structure, Thomas's other posts waited, holding whatever additional gifts or lessons he'd hidden for the daughter who'd learned to look beneath surfaces. Margaret Pierce's office looked different in morning light, less imposing, more functional. The mahogany and leather that had seemed designed to intimidate during the will reading now just looked like furniture that had aged well, practical choices made decades ago by someone who valued durability over fashion. Nora arrived at 9 sharp, having left Elliot at the workshop with strict instructions not to explore further without supervision. The teenager had been disappointed but understanding, recognizing that some discoveries required adult context before teenage enthusiasm got deployed. Margaret was waiting with files that looked decades old. Legal folders gone soft at the edges from repeated handling. She gestured Nora to a chair and began without preamble, the same professional efficiency she demonstrated at the will reading, minus the audience of contemptuous brothers. Your father established the first account in February 1987 when you were 4 years old. He walked into Portland Federal Credit Union with $20,000 in cash proceeds from furniture commission and opened what's called an ITF account, in trust for. The account was titled in his name as custodian, with you as beneficiary. She pulled out documents that confirmed the timeline account opening, papers showing Thomas's signature, Nora's social security number, the initial deposit amount. Everything official, documented, legal. Over the next 33 years, Thomas made regular deposits, sometimes $2,000, sometimes $50,000, depending on commissions and sales. He paid taxes on every dollar. The IRS knew about these accounts. They appear on his tax returns going back decades. Margaret spread out returns that showed the history income reported taxes paid, nothing hidden from government authorities. So it's completely legal. Nora needed confirmation, needed to know that her inheritance wouldn't evaporate in criminal investigation or tax fraud charges. Completely legal. Thomas structured everything properly. When he died, the ITF accounts transferred automatically to your name. No probate, no court involvement, completely outside the estate that your brothers inherited from. Margaret's certainty was absolute, honed by 35 years of estate litigation. But Garrett's going to argue Dad was hiding assets. The threat was obvious, even if timing remained uncertain. Let him argue. These accounts were established before your brother's children were born. Thomas had no obligation to disclose private financial planning to adult sons. The accounts were maintained for decades, all taxes paid, and all regulations followed. This is legitimate estate planning, not fraud. Margaret pulled out another folder, this one containing what looked like a journal, leather-bound pages, yellow with age. Thomas gave me this in 1985, 2 years before he opened the first account. He wanted documented proof of his intent, dating back to when you were a toddler. Nora opened the journal carefully, finding her father's handwriting, filling pages with observations about his children, his business, his growing conviction that Garrett and Rowan would waste any inheritance he left them, while Nora would use it to build something meaningful. June 15, 1985, Katie's third birthday. Brought her to the workshop while the boys went to sailing lessons they demanded but don't enjoy. She sat for 2 hours watching me cut dovetails, asking questions about why the angles mattered, how I knew where to cut. Garrett and Rowan at the same age were bored within 10 minutes. This child has her grandfather's patience, worth investing in. The entry continued across several pages, Thomas documenting his reasoning for what would eventually become multi-million-dollar inheritance strategy. Nora found references to Garrett's spending habits, Rowan's status obsession, her own interest in understanding rather than just acquiring. This is his defense. Margaret's statement was matter of fact. When Garrett challenges, and he will challenge, we present this journal. We show the judge that Thomas planned this inheritance when you were 3 years old. We demonstrate 4 decades of consistent intent. We prove that Thomas wasn't a confused old man manipulated by his daughter, but a skilled craftsman who spent years building financial legacy for the child who shared his values. How long until Garrett figures it out? The timeline mattered for planning purposes. His properties came with mortgages he doesn't know about yet. The notes were structured so they don't require payment until 6 months after transfer. Call it another 4 months before he gets the first payment demand and realizes the properties aren't worth what he thought. Margaret had clearly calculated this precisely. Rowan's portfolio, the bankrupt company holdings, that revelation might hit sooner. Maybe 2 months if he examines the statements carefully. So I have maybe 60 days before everything explodes. Nora felt pressure building, time compressing around decisions she needed to make, which is why we move fast. The furniture and tools we liquidate immediately through private sales and specialist auctions. The wood collection goes to dealers who handle rare species. Everything converts to cash in accounts bearing only your name. By the time your brothers discover what happened, the assets are secured and there's nothing they can challenge except the ITF accounts themselves. Margaret pulled out business cards, contact information for dealers and auctioneers who apparently specialized in exactly the kind of inventory Thomas had accumulated. Harrison Kimball in Boston handles high-end furniture. He's worked with your father's pieces before. One phone call and he'll drive up today to appraise the collection. Today, the speed felt aggressive. Today, because in 60 days, Garrett is going to petition for a forensic audit of your father's finances. He'll discover the accounts. He'll file a lawsuit claiming fraud or undue influence. Once that happens, moving assets becomes more complicated legally. We need everything liquidated and secured before he realizes what he's looking for. The strategy was clear, even if the pace felt breathtaking. Nora had gone from thinking she'd inherited a worthless building to learning she had $9 million in assets, to now facing pressure to liquidate everything within weeks before her brothers could mount legal challenge. What if the judge rules against me? The possibility had to be considered. Worst case, you have to split the ITF accounts 3 ways. That's $7 million divided by 3, roughly $2.3 million each. You'd still keep the furniture and tool proceeds because they're personal property in your possession. You'd walk away with maybe $3 million total. Still life-changing money, Katie. Margaret's worst-case scenario was oddly reassuring in its pragmatism. Best case, judge rules the ITF accounts were separate inheritance, properly structured, none of your brother's business. You keep everything, and our odds are good 70% at least. The documentation is solid, the timeline is clear, Thomas's intent is unambiguous. Nora absorbed the assessment, gaming out scenarios and probabilities. Even losing in court would leave her wealthier than she'd ever imagined being. But the thought of handing her brothers millions after their mockery at the will reading created resistance that was probably petty, but felt justified. How fast can we liquidate? Her question signaled decision. Furniture and tools 4 months if we push. Wood collection 6 weeks. The ITF accounts transferred to your name within 10 business days once we file the paperwork. Margaret was already pulling forms from drawers, beginning the administrative process that would convert Thomas's planning into executed reality. Then let's do it. Nora signed in where indicated her signature, transforming potential into action. Everything moves, everything secures. By the time Garrett figures out what happened, it's already done. Harrison Kimball arrived at the workshop 3 hours later, driving a Mercedes Sprinter van that suggested he was prepared to leave with inventory if prices aligned with expectations. He was exactly what Nora had pictured: wire-rimmed glasses, bow tie, careful movements that spoke of someone who spent his life around expensive objects that couldn't tolerate rough handling. Gus met him at the entrance, the two men greeting each other with familiarity that suggested they'd done business before. They descended to the basement together while Nora watched Harrison's face transform from professional interest to barely contained excitement. "I've heard rumors for years." Harrison moved from piece to piece, occasionally using a jeweler's loupe to examine joints, running fingertips along surfaces to assess finish quality. Thomas Brennan's private collection. Most dealers thought it was mythology stories people told to new apprentices. I never believed it was real. He stopped at the sideboard Gus had identified the previous evening, the figured walnut with hand-cut dovetails that looked like natural formation rather than human manufacture. Harrison pulled out his phone, taking photographs from multiple angles before turning to Nora with expression that mixed reverence and calculation. "For the collection complete, I can offer $850,000, cash within 48 hours. His opening bid came fast, suggesting he'd been calculating values as he examined pieces. Nora looked at Gus, who gave small nod of approval. "Fair price," his expression communicated. "You won't get better without auction, and auction takes months. I need everything liquidated within 4 months. Nora's counter requirement was non-negotiable. "Can you guarantee that timeline? 4 months is aggressive for this volume of museum-quality work." Harrison hesitated, clearly doing mental calculations about his network of collectors and dealers. "But yes, I can commit to complete liquidation within 16 weeks. Some pieces I'll buy myself. Others I'll broker to collectors I know personally. You'll get fair market value for everything. Not fair market value, fast liquidation value." Nora needed clarity about pricing. "I understand there's a premium for speed. What's the real number?" Harrison's expression shifted to respect. Apparently, he appreciated clients who understood the trade-off between price and velocity. "Complete collection, 16-week liquidation guarantee. I can do 1.1 million. That's my absolute ceiling. You could potentially get 1.3 or 1.4 at auction with the right buyers and patience, but you'd sacrifice the timeline." Gus whistled softly. "That's a strong offer, Katie. 300,000 premium over his initial bid just for agreeing to guaranteed timeline." The math was simple. Take 1.1 million now, with certainty, or gamble on auction prices that might be higher, but could also disappoint while missing the critical timeline for securing assets before Garrett's legal challenge. Nora extended her hand to Harrison. "Done. 1.1 million complete liquidation within 16 weeks. They shook on it, Harrison already pulling out his phone to arrange transportation and payment logistics. He'd take 10 pieces immediately, the most valuable items he could sell through his own gallery network, and begin coordinating auction placement for the remainder. First payment of 400,000 would arrive within 48 hours, balance upon completion of full liquidation. After Harrison departed with a van loaded with Thomas's finest work, Nora felt strange combination of relief and loss. The furniture her father had spent decades building was disappearing to private collections and museum acquisitions, the physical legacy being converted to capital that could be deployed toward other purposes. It felt simultaneously right and wrong, honoring Thomas's intentions while dissolving his tangible creations. He built it to be used. Gus's observation addressed the ambivalence Nora hadn't voiced. Thomas made furniture so it would outlive him, serve families across generations. That's happening whether you keep it or sell it. Only difference is you get to deploy the capital toward whatever comes next. The wood collection required different expertise. Margaret's recommended broker was based in Seattle, specializing in rare and restricted species with proper documentation. The phone call happened on speaker in the workshop office, Nora and Gus listening as the broker examined photos and certificates of origin that proved legal acquisition dates. "This inventory alone is worth 520,000, possibly more, madam." The broker's West Coast accent carried excitement despite obvious attempts at professional composure. "Brazilian rosewood, legally acquired in 1986, is essentially priceless to the right buyers. Cuban mahogany from 1990, same story. Your father built this collection when these species were still legal to harvest and export." Timeline. Nora cut to the critical question. "Export documentation takes time. 6 weeks minimum for full certification and legal clearance." The broker paused, calculating. but I can commit to that if you need speed. 520,000 certified check delivered upon pickup with all documentation complete. 4 weeks. Nora's counter was aggressive but necessary given the broader timeline constraints. 4 weeks is tight but doable. Let me make some calls to expedite the paperwork. I'll wire 50% deposit today balance on delivery. The broker's agreement came with the speed of someone who recognized good inventory when he saw it and wasn't going to lose the deal over a 2-week variance. The tool collection went to a Vermont auctioneer who specialized in antique woodworking equipment, a gruff man named Dennis, who walked through the basement with the focused attention of someone performing surgery. He photographed each tool, made notes about provenance and condition, occasionally making appreciative sounds that suggested genuine expertise rather than performance. This goes in my February auction. Prime time for tool collectors. They've got Christmas money burning holes in their pockets in spring project ambitions. Dennis's assessment was confident. Conservative estimate 180,000. Could run higher if the right bidders show up, but I never promise what I can't guarantee. 3 deals in one afternoon: furniture for 1.1 million, wood for 520,000, tools for 180,000 minimum. Nearly 2 million secured from inventory that had been sitting in Thomas's basement, accumulating value while the world above assumed he was just a carpenter with modest income and simple ambitions. The ITF account transfers proved simplest of all the transactions. Margaret filed paperwork with Portland, Federal, and Fidelity, presented death certificates and account documentation showing Nora as named beneficiary. The bureaucracy moved with surprising efficiency, perhaps because everything was properly structured and the transfers were routine from the bank's perspectives. 10 business days after Margaret filed the paperwork, Nora's phone buzzed with notification that made her stop walking mid-stride on Congress Street. Portland Federal transfer, complete, new balance, $7,031,341. She stared at the screen, trying to reconcile the number with reality. Yesterday, she'd been worried about how to pay for Elliot's winter coat. Today, she had $7 million in an account bearing her name, money that had been growing in her father's careful custody for 3 decades and was now hers to deploy however wisdom or foolishness dictated. The Fidelity transfer, completed 2 days later, $4,683,000 invested in index funds and municipal bonds that generated steady returns while preserving capital. Combined with the Portland Federal account and the secured inventory payments, Nora's total liquid assets would exceed $13 million once all transactions completed. $13 million. The number felt abstract, impossible, divorced from any reality she'd inhabited during her 38 years. Her entire life's earnings as an architect had probably totaled $600,000 pre-tax. Now she had 20 times that amount sitting in accounts that required decisions that she had no framework for making. She called Margaret immediately, the attorney picking up on the second ring. The accounts transferred. Nora's voice came out steadier than she felt. $7 million just appeared in my checking account. This is real. This is real, and Katie, you need to move that money immediately. $7 million in checking is foolish. No FDIC protection above $250,000. No returns, no security. Margaret's urgency was evident. I'm connecting you with a wealth management firm that specializes in sudden inheritance situations. They'll help structure proper accounts, diversification, tax optimization. I don't know anything about wealth management. The admission felt stupid but was accurate. That's why you hire experts. Trust me on this, your father did. He used the same firm for decades to manage his own accounts. They're discreet, competent, and they understand clients who need to move fast because of complicated family situations. The wealth management meeting happened 3 days later in a Portland office that suggested success without ostentation. 10th floor harbor views, good furniture that wasn't trying to intimidate staff who treated Nora like a person rather than a number. The advisor assigned to her case was a woman named Patricia Chen, early 50s, with the calm competence of someone who'd guided multiple clients through the psychological adjustment that sudden wealth required. First thing we do is secure the accounts properly. Patricia pulled up portfolio allocation models that meant nothing to Nora but apparently represented best practices for capital preservation and growth. We'll maintain liquidity for immediate needs while investing the majority in diversified holdings. Your father's accounts are currently too conservative, good for preservation but bad for growth, given your age and timeline. They spent 2 hours restructuring everything, moving money from checking to proper investment accounts, establishing trust structures that would protect assets from legal challenges, setting up tax advantage strategies that would minimize the inevitable government claim on her inheritance. Patricia worked with practiced efficiency, explaining each decision while moving at pace that suggested she understood urgency. One more thing. Patricia's tone shifted to something more personal. Sudden wealth often triggers relationship changes. Family members who ignored you suddenly become attentive. Friends develop financial emergencies. People start appearing in your life for reasons that have nothing to do with who you are. Be cautious about who you tell. The advice aligned with Gus's warning from the first evening, don't tell anyone until you're ready. Once people knew, everything changed. Nora had already been careful. Elliot knew, obviously, and Gus and Margaret and her team. But nobody else. Not the few friends she'd maintained after the divorce, not the clients she still did occasional architecture work for, definitely not her brothers. Garrett's call came 5 weeks after the will. Reading his voice carrying the edge, Nora recognized from childhood that particular tone that meant he'd discovered something that offended his sense of order, and now someone was going to pay for the inconvenience. Katie, we need to talk about Dad's finances. His use of her childhood nickname was deliberate positioning, establishing hierarchy before the conversation even began. What about them? Nora kept her voice neutral, giving nothing away. I've been reviewing his business records. Tax returns, bank statements, business account transactions. Something doesn't add up. Garrett's frustration bled through professional veneer. Dad claimed $50,000 to $80,000 a year in business income on his tax returns. Basic carpentry repair work, nothing special. But his business checking account shows deposits of $300,000 to $500,000 some years. Where was that money going? The question she'd been expecting, arriving exactly on Margaret's predicted timeline. Thomas had been moving money from business accounts to investment accounts for decades, funding the inheritance structure that Garrett didn't know existed. Yet, I don't know. Maybe he had expenses you're not seeing. Equipment materials. Subcontractors. Nora's lie was smooth, practiced over the weeks since she'd discovered the truth. I hired a forensic accountant. Richard Kellerman, he's the best in New England. He's tracing Dad's financial history back 30 years. If Dad hid assets that should have been in the estate, Kellerman will find them. The threat was explicit: cooperate or face legal warfare. Garrett, I inherited a building. That's it. I don't know anything about Dad's business finances. The statement was technically true. She didn't know about his business finances, specifically only about the personal investment accounts he'd maintained separately. We'll see. His skepticism was palpable. Kellerman's already found irregularities. Large transfers from business accounts to unknown destinations. If there's money hidden somewhere, Katie and you knew about it and didn't disclose, that's fraud. That's criminal. The accusation landed like a physical blow, but Nora kept her voice steady. Then it's good I have nothing to hide. She ended the call before he could continue, hands shaking with adrenaline that came from confrontation with brother, who'd spent their childhood making clear that youngest sister would never be his equal. Margaret needed to know immediately. The attorney's response was exactly what Nora needed: calm, analytical, prepared. Kellerman's good, but he's thorough, which means slow. 6 to 8 weeks for a complete audit. You have time, but not much. We need to finish liquidating inventory and secure everything before he discovers the accounts. What happens when he finds them? The discovery was inevitable. Thomas had paid taxes on the accounts for decades, leaving paper trail that competent forensic accountant would eventually trace. He finds $7 million in ITF accounts that transferred to your name upon your father's death. Garrett files a lawsuit claiming fraudulent conveyance or undue influence. We defend using the journal, the documented timeline, your father's clear intent spanning 4 decades. Margaret's confidence never wavered. We win 70% of the time based on the documentation. But Katie, you need to prepare for the fight. Garrett's going to be vicious. He'll say things designed to hurt you. He'll try to paint you as manipulative daughter who exploited elderly father. The prediction proved accurate sooner than expected. The break-in happened on a Wednesday night at 2 in the morning, the crash of splintering wood yanking Nora from uneasy sleep. Elliot appeared in her doorway instantly, eyes huge with that reflected what Nora was feeling. Someone's downstairs. The whisper was unnecessary. They could both hear heavy boots on the workshop floor below, voices conferring in tones that suggested coordination rather than random theft. Nora grabbed her phone, dialing 911, with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped it twice. The dispatcher promised immediate response, but police were 7 minutes away, and the intruders were here now, searching for something specific enough that they'd chosen to break in rather than simply steal tools from the less secured ground floor. She descended the interior stairs with Elliot safely locked in the bedroom, above phone in one hand and hammer in the other inadequate weapon against whatever was happening below, but holding it steadied her nerves fractionally. The ground floor revealed chaos, the side door hanging on twisted hinges, lock mechanism, destroyed by what looked like professional crowbar work. Two men in dark clothes were systematically searching the office area, pulling out file drawers, examining walls with the focused intensity of people operating on specific instructions. One was tapping walls with his knuckles, listening for hollows that would indicate hidden construction. "Check the lumber room. Boss said there's a hidden space. Find the entrance." The first man's voice was clear enough that Nora registered the command, along with its implications Garrett had sent them. Had hired people to break into the workshop and search for whatever Thomas had hidden. The second man was already moving toward the lumber storage, his systematic wall tapping, suggesting professional experience with building searches. Sirens cut through Portland's night quiet, distant but approaching. The intruders heard them too, exchanged glances that held calculation rather than panic. "Time's up, let's go." They left through the destroyed door without running, just two men who'd attempted a job and were now moving to the next thing on their schedule. Nora caught a glimpse of a black sedan pulling away as police cars turned onto marginal way lights, painting the workshop's brick exterior in alternating red and blue. Officer Martinez was young but competent, examining the forced entry while taking notes about what Nora had witnessed. "You said they were looking for a hidden room." "That's what I heard. One of them said their boss told them about a hidden room." Nora's statement was truthful as far as it went, omitting the part where she knew exactly what room they'd been seeking and who had sent them. "Any idea what they were looking for?" Martinez's pen hovered over his notepad. "My father owned this building for 40 years. Maybe he had projects or collections I don't know about." The half-truth felt safer than full disclosure. Nora wasn't ready to tell Portland PD about $9 million in hidden assets that would definitely complicate the investigation. "This looks professional, not random theft or vandalism. Targeted search by people who knew what they were looking for." Martinez examined the destroyed lock mechanism with the attention of someone who'd seen similar work before. "You have any enemies, business disputes, family issues?" The opening was perfect. "My father died recently. His estate is in probate. My brothers weren't happy with how the will was distributed." Martinez's expression shifted to understanding. "Family inheritance dispute. That makes sense. These things get ugly fast. I'll file a report, increase patrols on this street. You should install a proper security system, though. Whatever they were looking for, they'll probably try again." Gus arrived as police were departing his truck, rattling to a stop outside with timing that suggested he'd been waiting for her panicked text to justify driving over, despite the 3 a.m. hour. He surveyed the damage with anger that made him look more dangerous than his 68 years would suggest. This was Garrett. Statement, not question. He sent people to find the basement. They didn't find it. Nora had checked immediately after police left. The covering boards were still in place, entrance undiscovered. Garrett's searchers had been looking, but they hadn't known where to focus. "He'll try again. Now that he knows you're living here, knows the workshop has secrets, he'll keep pushing until he finds them." Gus's certainty was cold based on decades of watching Garrett operate. "We need to empty that basement completely. This week, before he can organize another search." The logistics proved exhausting but manageable. Harrison Kimball accelerated his pickup schedule, sending trucks for another 20 pieces of furniture. The Seattle broker arranged expedited shipping for the wood collection workers, loading hundreds of board feet of rare species lumber onto climate-controlled trucks. Dennis from Vermont drove down personally to collect the tool inventory, his van nearly scraping bottom from the weight of antique iron that collectors would fight over at auction. 4 days of frantic coordination later, the basement was empty. Bare concrete walls, the dehumidifier still humming, filing cabinets containing only business records that Nora needed for the inevitable legal battle. Everything of value had been removed, converted to certified checks and wire transfers deposited into accounts bearing only her name. $1.7 million from inventory sales. Gus tallied the numbers on a legal pad, his accountant's precision evident despite decades as a carpenter. Plus the $7 million in transferred accounts. $8.7 million total secured. The number was staggering even now after weeks of watching it accumulate. Thomas had built this fortune one commission at a time, one careful investment at a time, trusting that his daughter would understand what to do with it when the time came. The question was whether she actually did understand or whether she'd prove as fallible as the sons he'd written off as unable to learn. Court papers arrived via registered mail on a Monday morning 4 weeks after the break-in. Morrison v. Brennan Estate Trust filed in Cumberland County Probate Court. Garrett was challenging the ITF accounts, arguing that Thomas had fraudulently conveyed assets to avoid fair distribution, that he'd manipulated his daughter into accepting hidden wealth that should have been divided equally among all three siblings. The preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks, out enough time for both sides to prepare arguments and evidence. Nora read through the filing in Margaret's office, noting language that painted her as manipulative daughter who'd exploited her father's declining mental state to secure assets her brothers deserved. They're claiming Dad was senile. Her outrage was genuine despite having expected exactly this strategy. Standard tactic in these cases. They'll bring in a psychiatrist who never met your father to speculate about cognitive decline. We'll counter with medical records showing perfect mental health, the Mensa membership he renewed 6 months before death tax returns. He prepared himself, demonstrating complex financial understanding. Margaret dismissed the claim with professional ease, pulling files that would support the defense. The hearing took place on a gray morning in late May Cumberland County Courthouse, filled with the usual parade of disputes and grievances that Maine's legal system processed with bureaucratic efficiency. Nora wore the suit she'd purchased specifically for court appearances, professional but not expensive, projecting competence, without suggesting sudden wealth that would undermine her position as daughter who'd inherited a worthless workshop. Garrett and Rowan occupied the opposite side of the courtroom, with their attorney, Paul Sanderson, a state litigation specialist who'd built his career on challenging questionable inheritances. He looked exactly like someone who spent his time around bitter family disputes, expensive suit, predatory calculation, the slight smile of a man who enjoyed watching siblings tear each other apart over money. Judge Marianne Foster entered at 9 sharp, a woman whose reputation for no-nonsense rulings had made her legendary in Maine's legal community. She reviewed the case file for several minutes before looking up at the assembled parties with expression that suggested she'd seen this particular family drama too many times to find it interesting. This is a dispute over accounts titled in trust for the defendant, opened 3 decades ago by the deceased. Her statement was directed at Sanderson. Counsel, why should these accounts be considered part of the probate estate when they were clearly established as separate instruments? Sanderson stood with practiced smoothness. Your Honor, timing of establishment doesn't negate fraudulent intent. Thomas Brennan systematically diverted business income to these accounts, while his sons believed assets would be fairly distributed upon death. He created appearance of modest means while hiding $7 million. That's textbook fraudulent conveyance. So your argument is that a father can't favor one child over others in estate planning. Judge Foster's skepticism was evident in her tone. Our argument is that he can't hide assets to defraud legitimate heirs. These accounts were funded with income generated by a family business that supported all 3 children during their upbringing. Thomas Brennan owed his sons disclosure about where business income was being directed. Margaret stood without waiting for judicial prompting. Your Honor, Thomas Brennan established these accounts when his daughter was 5 and 7 years old, respectively. At that time, he had no obligation to disclose private financial planning to adult sons who were 24 and 22. The accounts were maintained for 33 and 38 years. All taxes paid, all regulations followed, complete documentation provided to the IRS annually. This is legitimate estate planning, not fraud. Judge Foster looked directly at Nora. Ms. Brennan, when did you become aware of these accounts? After my father died, Your Honor. Nora kept her voice steady despite her hammering pulse. I found documents hidden in the workshop he left me. Until that moment, I had no knowledge the accounts existed. And you've transferred them to your name? Yes, Your Honor. They were titled in trust for me. The transfer was automatic upon my father's death, as is standard with ITF accounts. The judge made notes, then looked back at Sanderson. Counsel, do you have evidence Ms. Brennan knew about these accounts prior to her father's death? Sanderson's hesitation was brief but telling. Not direct evidence, Your Honor, but the timing and circumstances are suspicious. Thomas Brennan was 72 when he died. Ms. Brennan lived in Boston but visited regularly. She had access opportunity motive. Suspicious isn't evidence. Judge Foster's warning tone was unmistakable. Do you have proof of manipulation or fraud? We have evidence of systematic asset diversion spanning decades. We have proof that Thomas Brennan hid significant wealth from his sons while allowing them to believe he was a man of modest means. That constitutes fraud regardless of when it began. Sanderson was pivoting to prepared argument, trying to recover ground lost in the exchange. Margaret stood again. Your Honor, may I present documentary evidence? She approached with the folder containing Thomas's journal, the letter from the hidden post, decades of tax returns. These documents establish clear, consistent intent dating back to 1985 when the defendant was 3 years old. Thomas Brennan explicitly planned to leave separate inheritance to his daughter based on documented observations about all three children's characters and financial habits. Judge Foster spent 15 minutes reviewing the materials, her expression unreadable. The courtroom was silent except for the occasional rustle of paper and the muted sounds of other proceedings echoing from adjacent rooms. Finally, she looked up decision evident before she spoke. Mr. Sanderson, your clients inherited substantial assets from their father. Property valued at over $4 million each according to the assessment they received. That Thomas Brennan chose to establish separate accounts for his daughter is his prerogative as both a parent and as the owner of those assets. The accounts were legally created, properly maintained, fully taxed for decades. I see no evidence of fraud, undue influence, or improper conveyance. She looked directly at Garrett and Rowan. Your father made choices about his estate that you disagree with. That doesn't make those choices illegal. He had the right to favor one child over others if he chose. The documentation shows he made that choice deliberately, consistently over a period of 40 years. Motion denied. The gavel came down with finality that echoed through the courtroom. Garrett's face flushed red, his hands gripping the table edge, hard enough that Nora could see white knuckles from across the room. Rowan looked more resigned than angry, as if he'd expected this outcome despite hoping for different result. Outside the courthouse, Garrett intercepted Nora before she could reach her car, his voice shaking with rage, barely contained by awareness that they were in public space with witnesses present. $7 million. You sat on $7 million while Rowan and I are drowning in debt from properties Dad left us. The accusation carried the weight of someone who felt genuinely wronged rather than outmaneuvered. Properties Dad paid off before he died. Nora's response was quiet but firm. You're the one who mortgaged them, Garrett. You're the one who over-leveraged. That's not Dad's fault, and it's not mine. You manipulated him. Near the end, when he was weak, you convinced him to hide assets from us. Garrett's desperation was showing now, grasping for explanation that preserved his self-image as someone who'd been victimized rather than someone who'd made bad choices. The accounts are 38 years old. I was 5 when Dad opened them. Nora let the timeline speak for itself. Did I manipulate him from kindergarten? Garrett had no response to that. He turned and walked to his BMW, the last remaining luxury purchase he hadn't yet had to surrender, movements, stiff with fury that had nowhere productive to go. Rowan lingered, his expression conflicted in ways his older brother's wasn't. Katie, his use of her childhood name sounded uncertain rather than condescending. Was Dad right about us? The question caught Nora off guard, the vulnerability in it contrasting sharply with Garrett's rage. What do you mean, in the letter Margaret read in court, about us wasting money while you'd use it wisely? Was he right about that? Nora looked at her middle brother, seeing exhaustion and doubt where confidence had always lived before. I don't know, Rowan, but you could prove him wrong. Start making different choices. It's not too late. He nodded slowly, processing something she couldn't fully read, then followed Garrett to the parking lot. Margaret joined Nora at her car, briefcase in hand, and satisfaction evident in her expression. That went as well as we could have hoped. Judge Foster barely needed to hear our full argument. The documentary evidence was overwhelming. The attorney's assessment was characteristically understated. It's really over. Nora needed confirmation, needed to believe the legal threat had passed. This round is over. Garrett could appeal, but he won't win. The law is clear. The facts support you. Precedent is on our side. Barring something extremely unexpected, you're secure. Margaret's caveat was lawyerly, but her confidence was genuine. Security felt foreign after months of anxiety. Nora drove back to Portland, processing the enormity of what had just concluded. The accounts were hers legally and completely. $8.7 million plus the workshop building itself. Her father's inheritance secured against challenge, protected by decades of planning and clear documentation. The question was what to do with it. Thomas had been explicit in his letter, build something that matters. But what did that mean in practical terms? What kind of building would honor his legacy while serving genuine purpose, beyond simply converting one form of wealth into another? Elliot was waiting at the workshop when Nora arrived, homework spread across the table, but clearly abandoned in favor of anxious waiting. Mom, we won. Nora pulled her daughter into a fierce hug. The judge ruled the accounts are legally mine. Uncle Garrett can't challenge them. So we're really okay. The hope in Elliot's voice was almost painful to hear. We're really okay, better than okay. We're secure, finally actually secure. She waited for relief to wash over her, for the months of anxiety to release their grip. Instead, she felt something else: responsibility. Thomas had entrusted her with fortune he'd spent his life building. The least she could do was use it the way he'd intended, not for survival or consumption or display, but for creation, for building something that would matter long after the money itself was forgotten. The workshop creaked around them, old timbers settling into evening, a building that had witnessed 40 years of Thomas's labor and now waited to see what his daughter would make of her inheritance. The basement sat empty, but the space itself remained potential, waiting to be filled with whatever Nora chose to create from the foundation her father had laid. Thomas had given her tools and resources and freedom to build whatever she wanted. Time would tell whether she had the wisdom to choose well. 2 years collapsed faster than seemed possible. June 2022 arrived with summer heat that made the workshop's second floor nearly unbearable despite the industrial fans Nora had installed during the first wave of renovations. She stood at a workbench teaching Carmen Rodriguez how to cut mortise and tenon joints, watching the 19-year-old's hands move with increasing confidence through wood that would have intimidated her 6 months ago. Again, Nora's instruction echoed Thomas's teaching style: economical, with praise, generous, with opportunity to improve through repetition. The tenon is still too loose. You need to feel the resistance when it seats. Carmen adjusted her technique, cut another joint, this one marginally better. She was one of 20 students in the inaugural cohort of the Thomas Brennan Skilled Trades Foundation, the nonprofit Nora had established with $5 million from her inheritance. The foundation offered full scholarships, tuition, tools, materials, living stipend for a 2-year woodworking apprenticeship designed to create skilled craftspeople rather than just hobbyists with expensive equipment. Brennan and Castellano. Design Build occupied all 3 floors of the workshop now. Ground floor held the showroom, custom furniture arranged under lighting that made grain patterns seem to glow from within. Second floor housed active carpentry, 8 workbenches, where apprentices learned techniques most furniture makers had abandoned for cheaper production methods. Third floor remained partly residential, but mostly transformed into Nora's architecture, office managing projects that ranged from kitchen renovations to commercial space design. Revenue topped $1.2 million annually, supporting 12 employees who depended on regular paychecks. The business had grown from Thomas's legacy into something that justified itself through quality and service, rather than just sentiment. Elliot moved through the space with casual ownership, now 16 and taller than Nora by an inch, sketching cabinet designs at a drafting table while simultaneously texting friends and listening to music that leaked from her earbuds in tinny percussion. She'd inherited Thomas's spatial intelligence combined with Nora's aesthetic sense, producing designs that were structurally sound and beautiful simultaneously. "Mom, check this out." Elliot swiveled her laptop to show an email that made Nora's chest compress with pride, sharp enough to hurt. Rhode Island School of Design acceptance letter, full scholarship for architecture, starting fall semester. The exact path Thomas had hoped for, validated by one of the country's premier design schools. Nora pulled Elliot into a hug that probably lasted too long, but she couldn't help it, couldn't release the daughter who'd endured poverty with grace and was now heading toward a future their grandfather had planned but never lived to see. "Ong Noi would be so proud." The words came out thick with emotion. "You taught me everything he taught you, same way he wanted." Elliot's voice was muffled against her shoulder. One generation passing to the next. Gus arrived at 7 as he had every morning for 2 years, his truck somehow still functional despite accumulating another 50,000 miles. He'd become co-owner when Nora had offered equity in exchange for his decades of expertise and industry connections, 45% each for Nora and Gus, 10% reserved for future partners. "We've got a good problem." His morning greeting carried satisfaction rather than concern. "Client backlog is 8 months. We're turning away $500,000 in potential projects because we can't scale capacity fast enough." The success felt surreal given that 24 months ago Nora had been worried about electric bills. Now the business had more demand than it could service, requiring strategic thinking rather than just harder work. The training program. Nora had been considering expansion for weeks. What if we scale it? Not just 20 students for our own needs, an actual school teaching woodworking to anyone who wants skilled trades careers. Gus's eyes brightened with interest that made him look younger than 68. Multi-year certification program, like the old guild system. Exactly. 10 students per cohort, 2-year training. Teach them everything Grandpa taught me. Best ones stay as employees. Others go work elsewhere, spreading the knowledge. The vision was clarifying as she articulated it. Thomas would love that. Gus examined her preliminary sketches with the critical eye of someone who'd spent a lifetime evaluating craftsmanship, creating skilled labor pool while preserving traditional techniques. That's legacy work. Rowan's call came on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying hesitation that was new for someone who'd spent his career projecting confidence in every interaction. Katie, can we meet? Not about money or legal stuff, just brother to sister. The request surprised Nora enough that she agreed before fully considering implications. They met the following morning at a waterfront cafe, Rowan arriving 3 minutes early, punctuality that represented significant change from his previous assumption that his time mattered more than other people's. He looked older in ways that transcended the 2 years since their last conversation. Thinner lines around his eyes suggesting stress or worry, or maybe just the erosion of confidence he'd once worn like armor. His clothes spoke of financial recovery without excess khakis and button-down, no luxury watch, simple gold wedding ring instead of the platinum and diamond band he'd previously displayed. Thank you for coming. His opening was direct, stripped of social performance. I wasn't sure you would. Nora sat across from him, studying the brother she'd grown up both loving and resenting. You said brother to sister. So talk. Rowan stared at his coffee long enough that Nora thought he might abort whatever he'd planned to say. When he finally spoke, the words came in a rush, suggesting they'd been building pressure for months. 2 years ago, when we lost the court case, I was furious. At you, at Dad, at everything. I felt cheated, but then I actually looked at my finances, really looked, and I saw Dad was right. He pulled out folded paper spreadsheet, printed in small font, detailing his financial collapse. Credit card debt, $180,000. Car payment, $2,200 monthly on a Porsche he'd leased because owning felt too permanent. Mortgage on the Cape house, $8,500 monthly. Monthly spending averaging $18,000 against take-home income of $14,000. I was hemorrhaging money while telling myself I deserved luxury because I went to law school. Self-loathing was evident in his assessment. The portfolio Dad left me, $3.8 million. I liquidated it to cover debts. Spent the rest maintaining lifestyle, gone in 18 months. All of it. The admission landed with weight that made Nora reassess everything she'd assumed about her brother's positions. What about now? Lost the house to foreclosure, car to repossession. My firm fired me because I was making mistakes distracted by financial stress. He looked directly at her for the first time. 6 months ago, I was living in a $1,200 apartment, driving a 10-year-old Honda, working as public defender for $55,000 a year. The mirror image of Nora's pre-inheritance life was too exact to be the coincidence. You hit bottom. I hit bottom. And Katie, I was happier than I'd been in a decade. His admission was quiet. First time in years I could sleep without panic attacks about money. Why are you telling me this? Nora needed to understand the purpose of this confession. Because I owe you an apology, real apology. You were right, Dad gave us exactly what we valued, and we wasted it. He gave you what actually mattered, and you built something meaningful. Rowan's hands wrapped around his coffee mug like he needed the warmth. I want to learn. From you, from Gus. I want to understand what Dad was trying to teach that I was too arrogant to hear. Learn what woodworking. The request seemed too dramatic for career change. How to build things that matter. How to create value instead of consuming it. His intensity suggested genuine desire rather than performance. I'm 42. I've wasted my life chasing appearances. I want to build something real, even if it's small, even if nobody's impressed. Nora studied her brother, looking for manipulation beneath the vulnerability. She found only exhaustion in what might have been genuine desire for change. Gus is starting a training program, 2-year apprenticeship. You could apply if you're serious. I'm serious. The immediate response carried conviction Rowan had rarely shown about anything. I know it sounds crazy, corporate lawyer wanting to learn carpentry, but I need this. Need to understand what Dad valued. 3 months later, Rowan completed his trial period with hands bearing permanent calluses and basic competence that surprised everyone, including himself. He'd produced 6 cutting boards, 3 small tables, and a chair that wobbled slightly but held weight. Amateur work, but it showed understanding of fundamentals that could be refined with practice. Gus evaluated the output with the same critical attention he'd give any apprentice candidate. You stuck it out. I didn't think you would. Neither did I. Rowan's admission was quiet. This is the hardest thing I've ever done, and I'm barely competent. Barely competent is where everyone starts. Craft requires patience. Gus extended his hand. Welcome to Brennan and Castellano Apprentice. The handshake seemed to mean more to Rowan than any contract he'd signed as a lawyer. His eyes were wet when he released Gus's hand, and he didn't bother hiding the emotion. Garrett's call came on a Tuesday evening in late November, his voice carrying tones Nora had never heard from him, defeat wrapped in something that might have been desperation. "Katie, I need to talk. I'm at the Portsmouth Bridge. Over the Piscataqua. I've been here for an hour, and I don't know what to do." Cold horror flooded through her. "Are you going to jump?" "I don't know, maybe. What's the point anymore? I've lost it everything." The drive took 83 minutes, Nora keeping Garrett on the phone the entire time, talking about anything that might anchor him to continued existence. She talked about the foundation, about Rowan's apprenticeship, about students learning skills Thomas had valued. She talked about childhood memories, about rare moments when Garrett had been kind rather than cruel. She found him sitting on the bridge railing, legs dangling over water that looked black in November night. He was 46 but looked 10 years older, hollowed out by losses that had stripped away everything he'd used to define himself. "Hey," she approached slowly the way you'd approach an injured animal. "I'm here." He turned, seeing her, and something in his face crumbled completely. "I'm so sorry for everything, for how I treated you, for Elliot, for being such an asshole about the inheritance. Come down and we'll talk." "Not here." Nora extended her hand. "Come home." The decision took longer than it should have, Garrett swaying slightly while weighing options. Finally, he took her hand and let her help him down solid ground beneath his feet again. They drove back to Portland in silence. When they reached the workshop, Elliot was waiting despite the late hour. "Chew, Garrett." Her voice was uncertain. "Hey, Sophie, Elliot. Sorry." Garrett caught himself. "I'm sorry for what I did, sending that man, scaring you." "There's no excuse." Elliot studied him with direct teenager assessment. "You look terrible." "I feel terrible. I've made a lot of mistakes." Garrett's self-awareness was new. A lifetime of mistakes. "Mom says everyone gets second chances." Elliot's statement was directed at Nora as much as Garrett. "That's what the foundation does." The following morning revealed the full extent of Garrett's collapse. He'd lost all 4 properties to foreclosure, professional reputation shattered by bankruptcy, no job prospects. He'd been working construction for $18 per hour until fighting with a foreman led to termination. The car he'd been sleeping in was impounded for unpaid tickets. Gus's proposal was characteristically practical. Foundation expansion. We're building new training facility, 5,000 square feet. He could manage the build. 65,000 salary, but conditional on therapy, AA meetings, formal apology to Elliot. One screw up, he's out. Garrett took the job. The first month was brutal, his ego colliding with the reality that he was working for his younger sister. But slowly something shifted. Working alongside students who'd survived worse provided perspective. Managing construction with limited budget required creativity. He'd let atrophy during years of excess. 6 months into his rehabilitation, Garrett asked Elliot to walk along the waterfront. They returned an hour later, Elliot's expression suggesting complicated emotions rather than clear resolution. He apologized, really apologized. Her assessment was thoughtful. Explained why he did what he did, took responsibility, didn't make excuses. Then asked if I could forgive him. "Can you?" Nora needed to know. Eventually, not today, but maybe, if he keeps changing. The 5th anniversary of Thomas's death arrived in October 2025, marked by a gala fundraiser at the Portland Museum of Art. 400 people attended, a mix of business leaders, government officials, and families who'd benefited from foundation training. The statistics were remarkable. 120 students trained over 5 years. 87% job placement within 6 months average, starting salary $55,000. 2.5 million invested in scholarships and facilities. Nora stood at the podium feeling like an imposter, despite having earned the right to speak about her father's legacy. 5 years ago, I inherited a workshop my brothers called garbage. They were wrong. It wasn't garbage. It was treasure. Not the money my father hid, though that mattered. The real treasure was the lesson: wealth is what you build, not what you have. She called Gus first, then Rowan finally, Garrett, all 3 standing to applause that acknowledged their journeys. Before Nora could continue with prepared remarks about expansion plans, Rowan and Garrett approached the stage together. "We'd like to announce something." Rowan's voice carried through the microphone with steadiness that came from hard-won recovery. "Garrett and I are donating our remaining assets to the foundation. He's contributing $2.8 million from settlement of property lawsuits. I'm contributing $3.2 million from sale of my home, the last thing I owned. Combined $6 million donation." The audience stood, applause filling the museum gallery. Nora felt tears threatening, overwhelmed by the gesture from brothers who'd spent years resenting her before learning what Thomas had tried to teach them. Dad wanted us to learn that wealth isn't what you keep. Garrett's voice broke slightly. It's what multiplies when you give it away. We're still learning, but we're trying. Nora met them on stage, the three Brennan siblings embracing for the first time since childhood, years of resentment dissolving in the shared understanding that their father's lesson had finally landed. The tackle box appeared 3 days after the gala, sitting on Nora's desk with a note in Elliot's handwriting. Found this in storage. Thought you should have it. Nora opened it carefully, finding another letter from Thomas. This one dated 1 week before his death, written after the hidden post letter, but before he'd known exactly when the end would come. Katie, if you're reading this, you succeeded. I knew you would. The workshop isn't just a building. It's a lesson about what actually constitutes wealth. You learned that lesson. Now teach Elliot what I taught you. Inside this box is my first chisel from 1978, your inheritance. Nora lifted the chisel, feeling its weight, the handle worn smooth by 40 years of her father's grip. She called Elliot, who appeared in the doorway with the knowing expression of someone who'd planned this revelation. This is yours now. Nora extended the tackle box. Your real inheritance, not money. The lesson about building things that matter. Elliot took the box reverently, understanding without explanation what it represented, not just a tool, but a philosophy, not just an object, but a responsibility to carry forward what Thomas had begun. The workshop floor was quiet at 6 a.m. the morning after Nora, arriving early, in clothes still formal from the gala because she hadn't been able to sleep. She found Garrett already there, sanding a plaque he'd been working on for days. Thomas Brennan, Master Builder, 1948-2020. Couldn't sleep either. Her question was gentle. Wanted to finish this before students arrive. His hands shook slightly as he worked. I spent 40 years running from Dad's work. Now I spend every day trying to be worthy of it. Rowan arrived minutes later, also unable to sleep, the three siblings working together to install the plaque above the workshop entrance. Students started arriving at 7, first among them, Carmen Rodriguez, who touched the plaque reverently before moving to her workbench. Nora's phone buzzed with text from Elliot, already at RISD for first day of architecture class. Ong Noi would be proud. She replied immediately, he is. The workshop filled with morning activity, students arriving, tools being selected, projects continuing from previous days. Nora moved to a workbench where Carmen was struggling with an advanced joint, picked up Thomas's chisel from where she'd left it, demonstrated the proper technique. Again, her instruction echoed across years, connecting her to Thomas, to his own teachers, stretching back through generations. Feel the resistance. The wood tells you where to cut. Carmen repeated the cut, this time perfect. The joint seated with satisfying precision that came from understanding rather than luck. Now teach someone else. Nora handed Carmen the chisel, watching as the 19-year-old moved to instruct another student, the knowledge passing from hand to hand, generation to generation. The work continued. It always would. Thomas had built the foundation. Nora had secured it. Elliot would carry it forward. And somewhere in the chain of teaching and learning and building, Thomas Brennan's legacy would persist, not as money or buildings or fame, but as skill transmitted across time, wisdom embedded in joints that would hold long after everyone currently alive had become memory themselves. Sawdust caught morning light streaming through workshop windows. Harbor sounds drifted in with salt air. The building creaked with familiar sounds of used timber and tools and human effort combining to create value that transcended accounting. Nora looked around the space her father had built, seeing not what it was, but what it would become: training ground for hundreds more students, laboratory for preserving craft that industrial age had tried to eliminate, bridge connecting past to future through the simple act of teaching people to build things with their hands. The inheritance was secure. The lesson was learned. The work continued.